The perspectives expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guests. The views expressed are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the National Institute of Health or the United States government.
Hey, Sickle family. I'm Wumi Bakare.
And I'm Dima Hendricks. And we would like to welcome you to the Through the Genes podcast,
where we talk about living, healing, recovering, and exploring curative therapies for sickle cell disease.
We will also talk about our individual curative therapy journeys and the bond that we built as sickle cell sisters.
Red blood cells are like a disc, almost like a frisbee, if you will. And in sickle cell disease, what happens is the hemoglobin molecules inside that cell snap together like Legos. And when they do that, they can change the shape of that cell from a frisbee to a more sickle form, a banana shape or curved shape, which is what the disease gets its name from, of course.
Because the red blood cells are that crescent shape, they don't live as long and they don't carry oxygen very well.
A shortened red blood cell lifespan results in a cascade of events occurring in the body: chronic anemia, severe pain, strokes, fatigue, decreased lung function, kidney function, heart function, and ultimately for the adults, a decreased lifespan. In the last decade, there's been an explosion in the options to cure sickle cell disease. The science is as elegant as it gets in human work. That you can take somebody's cell, fix that person's cell, put that cell back into that individual, and they're going to be cured of that disease. That is just a beautiful concept that we all dream about.
This is a completely new way of thinking about sickle cell, and engaging patients in these conversations is so important.
That discussion is not a 4-hour discussion. That discussion is over years because it's experimental therapy and the information is evolving.
There's a role for this expensive, more scientifically amazing curative type therapies. But also we must focus on eliminating the disease burden in a broader population.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Through the Genes. My name is Dima Hendricks, and today I'm joined by my beautiful sickle cell sister, Wumi Bakare. Wumi, say what's up to the people.
Hey, Sickle family. Okay,
Hi.
first and foremost, people got to check out what's happening here, all right? Fearless Warrior, check. Sickle Sister, check. Lover of the color purple, triple check, okay? Fit is right, face is right. All right, well, hi everyone. So I'm Wumi, and I want to share with you my sickle cell story. So, sickle cell is the rock on which I have built my perfectly imperfect life. But for many years, I was plagued by this debilitating blood disease. In 2015, what started as a summer vacation turned into a nightmare when I was diagnosed with MAC infection, which stands for Mycobacterium avium complex. And that bacterial infection started in my lungs and then spread to my kidneys, my liver, and my entire bloodstream, leading to a cycle of vaso-occlusive pain episodes that was ongoing for about 2 years. I was genuinely desperate to see my 30th birthday, and that kind of led me to start researching curative therapies for sickle cell disease. And then in 2019, I went to the National Institutes of Health and participated in a stem cell clinical trial. And so I live my life today sickle cell free, but of course, still navigating some of the complications that I experienced from having sickle cell disease for well over 30 years. Now, for me, I like to say I was able to turn my pain into purpose, and that has led me to becoming a patient advocate and a thought leader. But my goal is to erase the stigma of sickle cell disease through proactive and reactive engagement with the media, as someone who has a 15-year background in PR and communications. I honestly believe that if we tell authentic patient stories, then we can inspire compassionate and respectful care for this underrepresented community. Now, Dima, I know we share a few things in common, so why don't you tell us about your sickle cell story?
So, like you, I was desperate to find a cure. Living with sickle cell disease left me with many complications, a mini stroke, blindness in one eye, numerous hospitalizations, and enduring the relentless agony of sickle cell crises. In my desperation, I signed up for a clinical trial,
Okay.
and it was for a potential curative therapy, as you know. But unfortunately, I developed a blood clot at the end of a dual lumen port,
Mhm.
and it was the same port used to extract my stem cells. The blood clot lodged into the right side of my ventricle of my heart, and I had to have open heart surgery. I said my goodbyes to my family, but
Yes.
I woke up and there was many complications later after the open heart surgery, iron overload, uh, just to name a few. But I was released from the clinical trial. Um, but my unfortunate journey further ignited my passion for advocacy. And I hold space for the community because I feel like the warrior battle is mine to share. And together we can march forward through the pain. So I continue to fight through the pain.
I
And,
have survived through the pain.
and together we're here to present Through the Genes.
Episode 1: The History of Sickle Cell Research with Vence Bonham.
So we just heard our stories. Wumi and I shared our transparent journeys through curative therapy. And before we go and delve into the curative therapy process, and before we talk about stem cell research, I want us to delve into the history of sickle cell disease. So for that, we have a very special guest, Mr. Vence Bonham. He's the acting deputy director of the National Human Genome Research Institute at the National Institute of Health. I would love to welcome you to the show. Welcome, Mr. B.
Thank you for inviting me to the show. I'm so happy to be here today.
Absolutely. So, before we talk about gene therapy, can we discuss the history of sickle cell disease? Let's start with Walter Clement Noel.
Yeah, so the history of sickle cell disease in Western medicine, and I want to just to make a note to that. We're only talking about Western medicine because when you think about the history of sickle cell disease and think about the experiences of people living with sickle cell disease in sub-Saharan Africa and India before it was identified in Western medicine, it's important to recognize also. But we have most literature and understanding about the history of sickle cell disease in Western medicine. So in 1910, James Herrick published a case report about one of his patients. And that patient was Walter Clement Noel. And Mr. Noel was a dental student in Chicago at the time that he was seen by Dr. Herrick. And Dr. Herrick saw Mr. Noel and identified these unusual red blood cells with regards to his patient. And that was truly the first identification of sickle cell disease in Western medicine. But it's important to just say that Walter Clement Noel was a dental student who was from Grenada, who was in Chicago, and had done a lot in his life and got to that point in his life and was identified as having these unusual or sickled red blood cells. So he was clearly the first individual identified within Western medicine. But if you think about the history of sickle cell disease in Western medicine, and particularly in the United States, there really is this history of racism, a history of inequity, a history of discrimination. And so when we come to now 2024 and all the things that have happened over the last period of time, we must think about some of the milestones that have occurred over the history of sickle cell disease. I just want to highlight a couple for you. So one of them I would like to highlight is that in 1949, Linus Pauling, who was a Nobel laureate, identified sickle cell disease as the first molecular disease. But also, Dr. Pauling identified that he believed that people who lived with sickle cell disease should get a tattoo on their forehead so they don't have children. And clearly, this eugenics perspective of sickle cell disease is also part of the Western medicine of sickle cell disease. The highlights with regards to treatment, there was not a treatment for sickle cell disease until 1998. So think about it. Identified first in 1910, and the first treatment for sickle cell disease was not until 1998. And so if you think about this period of time and individuals living with sickle cell disease and not having any treatments as a therapeutic to help address the disease, we must recognize that. But 1998, hydroxyurea was approved by the FDA for adults living with sickle cell disease. The first bone marrow transplant or stem cell transplant was not until 2009. And then in 2017 through 2019, we finally got some additional treatments for sickle cell disease. And then the first clinical trial for gene therapy with gene editing was started in 2019. So that's really a part of the context of the history of this disease.
Thank you for that amazing history lesson, because I think oftentimes as patients within the community, including caregivers, we don't really know how much inequality and systemic racism has gone into it. I mean, if it was identified in 1910 and there wasn't a drug approved by the FDA till 1998, I can only imagine what patients who are born within that space and time must have gone through. We think we're dealing with other inequities within the healthcare system, not fully realizing that those that came before us probably had it harder because at the time there wasn't a standard of care treatment. But for me, I'm curious as to what led to you wanting, or what birthed your passion for genomics? Because in our introduction to you, I mean, the National Human Genome Research Institute, it's a mouthful.
Yes.
In all sincerity. And so for me, I always like to know the backstory of what led to your interest in genomics, and then what inspired you to create a project such as the Democratizing Educational Materials for Sickle Cell Disease Gene Therapy project that I was blessed to be a part of.
So my passion for genetics and genomics really is a context of family history, of my personal history, of inequities that I saw within the healthcare systems that were related to individuals with genetic conditions. So as a warrior myself and someone who has lived with sickle cell disease, I've seen the experiences and the inequities that people have had over the years. So I had a passion to focus in on healthcare disparities and health disparities and health inequities, not just for sickle cell disease, but broadly about healthcare in the United States. And so that has been a passion of my own work historically, and has expanded to my work and interests from a global perspective. But a recognition that sickle cell disease is an example of a disease where there has been clear inequities in its history. And there are opportunities going forward, but we still are in a situation where inequities in treatment and care exists.
Yes. And that's a great point to note. It's evident that we see the significant health inequities, especially with our communities of color. So how can you empower families and patients to increase equity in their healthcare?
Well, when I think about equity in healthcare, I'm thinking about the ability for each individual to receive the best health possible. That their health is not limited because of a social status, a location, or a condition that they may have. That they are receiving the best care possible. And so I think it's extremely important for parents and caregivers and individuals living with sickle cell disease to always advocate to make sure they are getting the best care possible, to recognize that the care is not equitable across our country. So we must identify the best care settings for an individual in different situations, and really to challenge to make sure that the healthcare system is trustworthy of providing care to that individual, and that they are providing the best care. So I think that there's always an importance for families and individuals living with sickle cell disease to always be asking the questions, to learn more information, to help them with regards to their treatment. And that's what brought me to the Democratizing Sickle Cell Disease Gene Therapy Education Project, was the need to make sure that individuals have access to the information to make informed decisions about what they want with regards to treatment, and a recognition that treatment is not going to be the same for each individual. The life experience is not the same for each individual, and we need knowledge, and that knowledge needs to be accessible to individuals.
Over the course of your career, you have conducted numerous studies. For you, what has been the most alarming statistic or data that has come through that has really shocked you beyond your wildest dreams? Because a lot of times in research, for most people, they assume it's relatively mundane. But I would imagine that for you to continue in this work, there has to be something that's continuously inspiring you and motivating you. So, over the course of your research, can you share with us some of your highlights, low points, things that you've learned along the way, so that as the audience, we kind of you're giving us a glimpse into genomics and the work that the National Institutes of Health does?
Well, I'll highlight two things that I think are important. And I am going to frame this primarily around sickle cell disease, but I'll put it into a larger context. I think one of the frames that I would want to put is that the data continues to show the inequities with regards to lifespans of individuals based on racial and ethnic background. And this is significant. And that's not about genetics. That is about the social determinants, the social experiences of individuals' lives. And as we learn more about the importance of genetics and genetics variation in health and disease, we also are learning more that the major reason for these inequities based on racial and ethnic groups has nothing to do with genetics. So that's one milestone I would identify. The second one is related to sickle cell disease. And it's one that I think is why our conversation about gene therapy is important, but we have to be humble and put it into context that the lifespan of adults living with sickle cell disease is not expanding. There was a recent study that was just published in California showing that actually the lifespan is going down for adults living with sickle cell disease. So a recognition that here in 2024, now with these exciting new gene therapies, there's still major challenges with regards to the health and the life of individuals living with sickle cell disease. So why is that important? That means that these gene therapies and these approaches are exciting, and I know this podcast is really exploring those, but we also must think about all of the healthcare that's needed for individuals, and a recognition that not everybody's going to be eligible for some of these new transformative treatments. So a recognition that there's much more to do with regards to improving the lives of individuals living with sickle cell disease.
Well, I just learned something new. I was in La La Land thinking that the lifespan of a sickle cell warrior is expanding and not decreasing. Um, what do you think are the elements that attribute to that phenomenon?
Well, again, I think this context of the social context of people's lives is an important part of it. And I think that there's also the issue of the type of healthcare that's accessible to individuals. And are individuals getting appropriate preventative care? Are individuals getting holistic care, comprehensive care? And I think that is a challenge of why certain individuals' lifespans are not increasing, but decreasing. And a recognition that environment plays an important role in making sure that people have access to all the improvements that have happened, over the last 20 years for individuals living with sickle cell disease. So it really is a situation of the haves and the have-nots, and making sure that everyone has the benefit of where we are with the treatments that are available today, as well as continue to do research to expand these treatments, because there's so much more that we need to do.
Thank you for sharing that, because you not only opened my mind, but helped me recognize that access to care is not the same for every warrior out there. And I would also say that even in the patient community, a conversation among warriors is oftentimes, is my care team educating me enough on the disease modifying therapies available to me and the curative transformative therapies available to people with my chronic illness as well. But last month, we hit a pivotal moment in history for the sickle cell disease community with the approval of gene therapy for two pharma companies. Now, as a proud Nigerian, one of the conversations I continue to have is many warriors who are abroad outside the United States wondering if these curative therapies are ever going to reach their region. So, can you talk to us about what are your hopes for the future? Because one of the recurrent conversations we have is that you constantly say, our work isn't done. We have a lot more work to do. So, can you share with us today some of your hopes for the next 5 to 10 years within sickle cell disease research and care?
No, I think that there's so much to be done, and a recognition that the true burden of sickle cell disease is not in these high income Western countries, but truly in sub-Saharan Africa and India is where the significant burden. And will countries, will Nigeria, will other countries have access to these new treatments and therapies? So I would just say two issues. One is there's research going on, there's work going on in these countries. There are development of actually new centers in some countries to bring these treatments, bring stem cell transplant, to bring gene therapy to these countries. There's a recognition of this inequity that exists. But also there is the issue of there's some exciting research that's going on at the National Institutes of Health and at other institutions around in vivo gene therapy. So the ability to do these types of treatments, not in these quaternary, high healthcare systems and hospitals across the country and across the world, but also in community hospitals, and the ability to do this in places that are more accessible where the significant burden is. So there's a lot of exciting things that are happening. But again, I want to step back and say it's not just gene therapy or stem cell transplant that's not available in these countries. Treatments are not. Hydroxyurea is not available. Penicillin is not available. So how do we end up making sure that we advance the health of everyone with the recognition of both these new technologies and these new treatments, but also what we understand will clearly help benefit the lives of individuals living with this disease? So we have to go at this from both addressing the issue of how we bring standard of care and improve that care within these geographic areas, as well as how do we bring these new technologies and these new treatments.
Mr. Vence Bonham, every time we are together, I learn something new. This has been a very informative interview. I'm blessed that we have you to be a part. So thank you so much for joining us at Through the Genes. Is there anything else that before you leave, is there anything that you want to impart to our audience members?
Well, I'm excited about the Democratizing Sickle Cell Disease Gene Therapy Education Project of bringing the community together, individuals who are patients and caregivers, and the scientists that are conducting these clinical trials and developing these treatments, the agencies that are involved in helping to make these come to practice, the clinical care, bringing them all together, but importantly, to hear the voices of the community. And we are excited, and we're excited to move forward with this project in a way to make sure that information is accessible to the community so that they can make decisions about their own lives and their own treatments. So with that, I'm looking forward. We have had a major milestone in December of 2023 with the approval of these two new treatments. It is an exciting time for sickle cell disease, but we have much more work to do.
I'm gonna ask one more question. What inspired the democratizing project? Because being a part of that felt like a moment in time. I think the very first session, there was a moment where I was emotional because I had never seen all of these primary stakeholders brought to the table at the same time, where it felt like we were peers as opposed to the the clinicians are here and then the patients are right here, the caregiver community is right here. So what for you, what was the true inspiration behind that project? And can you share with us a little bit, how did you go about putting that together, convincing everyone to come to the table for one great cause?
So over my research career, a primary area of my work is working with communities and conducting community-based participatory research. So working with communities, not working just in a silo as a researcher off on my own. Having the voices and the perspectives and the input of the community is an essential part of my work. And some of my early work that was not about sickle cell disease, but was about genetics and genomics, was bringing different communities and voices together. So the Democratizing Sickle Cell Disease Gene Therapy Education Project was a component of that, a recognition that only when you bring everybody together with their views and their perspectives can you create the level of information that you want, and to make sure that it is reaching the needs of the community. So it's a part of a process. And I was honored that people said yes and were willing to make the commitment of time to spend those days together and to review materials and to provide their input, because everyone really is seeking to make this community's health better who are engaged in this research. And so I'm excited and honored to have that ability. And I just want to thank everyone who was part of the Democratizing Project for the time and energy and their perspectives that they brought to the table.
The Democratizing Education for Sickle Cell Disease Gene Therapy was developed by the National Human Genome Research Institute. The goal of the project is to develop open source, high quality patient education materials for sickle cell disease gene therapies. With the rapid and promising advancement of gene therapy, it is important that the sickle cell community is equipped with information to make informed decisions about the risks, benefits, and limitations of new cell and gene based therapies. I think a lot of times it's important to reflect, because a lot of people, I like to say, they crawled so we could walk and fly today. And so to see kind of the from 1910 to 98, it's jarring to recognize how many decades have passed before a medication, a disease modifying drug was created. But it's also important to note that this has been one disease area that for a long time has just been underrepresented, and enough focus hasn't been gone into that. But so I had the privilege of learning from you and learning with you when you put together a phenomenal project that really brought together all of the primary key stakeholders within the sickle cell space. And that was the Democratizing Education for Sickle Cell Disease Gene Therapy project. Can you tell us a little bit about, for you, what was the goal and purpose of that project?
So the goal of the Democratizing Sickle Cell Disease Gene Therapy Education Project was to provide a forum, an opportunity for the community to come together, to make sure that the community, and particularly caregivers and patients and families, have accurate information about the risks and benefits of sickle cell disease gene therapy that are not aligned necessarily with the companies that are moving forward the work, but that is scientifically accurate in a way to help communities and be accessible to communities. So we wanted to make sure that the community created these materials, that these materials were not just created by researchers, but created by people living with sickle cell disease and their caregivers, as well as their physicians, as well as the researchers, as well as the biotech companies and the government, coming together in a way to provide accessible information for the community. And that is the key of this. And more today, now with these new treatments, this information is needed. And so that we can provide what I describe as honest broker type information that's not necessarily have the marketing of a company, but does provide information that you can then take to your physician and to really to learn more about these treatments and help to make decisions whether they're good for you.
Now, this project is absolutely amazing. It allows patients, caregivers to actually research and look before any biotech company comes into the situation or tries to recruit a patient. And it actually, I feel that we were able to amplify the voice of not only the patients but the caregivers as well. So why is it important for you in particular to amplify the underrepresented patient voice?
Well, I think the voice of individuals living with sickle cell disease is so important. I think this is an example of a disease that has had significant neglect over history. And so, as a researcher at the National Institutes of Health, I see it's important that we provide information about these new exciting therapies and understanding them better so that people can make informed decisions. And so I really see this as a really important time within the sickle cell disease community. And only with information can people make judgments and decisions that are important for them and their families.
A lot of the work that we did while working on that project is available. And for listeners, we are going to link all of the information because a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of work, hard work was put into this. And I'm proud to say that I have never been more excited about what was taking place because it felt like for a first time, at least in my personal opinion, that we had all of the important voices at the table, but everyone came leaving their ego at the door, coming with wanting to be more educated, wanting to be more informed, but more importantly, there was a bigger goal at the end. And so I think that was reflected in the entire process. So if you are listening and you are a sickle cell patient or a caregiver, I really highly recommend that you view these educational materials because a lot of thought and work was put into it. And I think providing unbiased information to the patient community is so important in the day and age that we live in because when we are more informed, then we are better equipped to be able to self-agent and advocate for ourselves. So thank you for that contribution. Now I want to dive a little bit deeper into your personal story. What inspires your work in research? What lit that passion in you as a young man in college? How can you kind of give us a little bit of a context as to how you became Mr. B?
Yeah, well, that's a question that's really related to my life experience and my parents and where I grew up. I grew up in a segregated neighborhood in Lansing, Michigan, which is, a city that is in the Midwest, but still it was a very segregated city when I grew up. And seeing the health inequities and health disparities in my community was important in context of why I was always interested in health policy and issues with regards to how do we improve the health of our communities. And then my own life experience and unique experiences of learning about how do you make sure that you take care of your own health, improve your health, and what are the challenges and barriers that exist. So I think all of those things help to make me who I am and the research that I'm interested in. But I think the most important focus really would be a recognition that only when we take responsibility and move forward to make sure we have good information, that we advance the research, that we share issues of importance around the sickle cell disease community, around African Americans, around people of color, how do we make sure that their health is being improved? And so that's really how I got to be where I am today. And you know, well, he's a lawyer. Well, I went back and did a health services research fellowship and trained with mentors at University of Michigan in the School of Public Health and the medical school at Michigan State University to really get to this point with regards to the research and the work that I do today.
Wow, what an informative discussion. Thank you, Mr. Bonham, for that detailed history lesson on sickle cell disease research and treatment. Now, it is an honor to introduce this next special guest. Dr. Matthew Hsieh is the Senior Research Physician in the Cellular and Molecular Therapeutics Branch of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at the NIH. He is my personal transplant doctor, and he is going to shed some light on sickle cell disease phenotypes and genotypes.
Wumi and I would like to welcome you, Dr. Hsieh. Thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me.
So I understand you were Wumi's doctor during her procedure.
That's right.
Was she a good patient?
Yes. Yes. Of course, that's a loaded question, right? No, I'm just kidding. No, Wumi's terrific.
Wumi is my dear sickle sister, but I just wanted to start. Let's go back into the genetics of sickle cell disease before we get into gene therapy.
Sure. As you and many of your audience know that sickle cell disease is something that you inherit from birth. Sickle gene is a mutation of the normal beta globin gene and the beta globin is a part of the hemoglobin molecule that binds and carries oxygen so that we would derive energy from it. If you have enough hemoglobin in your system and have enough red blood cells, you are normal blood count, so to speak. But if your hemoglobin or your red blood cell count is low, that's the term anemia or anemic, comes in. And so for sickle mutation, you inherit one copy of that from each of your parent, and that's the prototypical SS or HBSS that you hear commonly. That's probably the most common type of sickle cell disease that we see. So HBSS. But there are other different types of sickle disease. You can have you inherit one copy of the sickle from one parent, but then you might inherit like the beta thalassemia from another parent, and then you have something called sickle beta combined together into one. And some of the sickle beta thalassemia can be just as severe as sickle disease, but sometimes it's a little bit more mild. So you really have to work with your doctor about which of the sickle beta thalassemia types that you have. And then the last, the more common one is rather than having two sickle mutation, you inherit one sickle mutation from one parent, but then you inherit the C, hemoglobin C from another parent. That's more common in sort of Western Africa region, and from migration, we see a lot of that from the Caribbeans. Ancestry patients. So those are the four, the common types of sickle cell that we see.
Thank you for that explanation, because a lot of times, especially when we delve into the conversation of curative therapies, it seems like most people are more familiar with hemoglobin SS, which we know is the most common type of sickle cell disease. But I will beg to ask this question. Could you give us a brief summary of how SC, S beta tau, how they manifest in patients that differentiates them from hemoglobin SS?
I think that's a little tougher. The SS patients and the more severe portion of the S beta, or what we call the S beta 0, they are the more severe type, and they tend to have they're more anemic, so their hemoglobin level is lower. They tend to have more pain crises. But the other, so that's the more severe type. The other two, the sickle beta, what we call plus, or the SC disease, they tend to be more mild, but they have sort of different sets of complications. meaning that sometimes they have a little bit more joint damage. They have a little bit more, sickle-related eye disease.
Okay. So I heard of other, I know we're on this topic of SCSS. I've heard of some very obscure genotypes like SO, I believe. And like, could you explain how these other genotypes are passed down to individuals? Like I've heard of SO through someone else, and I just wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, having these sort of sickle-related mutation, how evolutionarily how they came about is that these mutations helps to protect the red blood cells from destruction when the person's infected with the malaria. Mm-hmm. So because when you have these mutations, these red blood cells are a little bit more resistant. Not that they can't, it's just a little bit more resistant to the malaria infections. So the individuals with either sickle trait or sickle disease, the parasites don't multiply it as well, and therefore those that have these traits tend to live a little bit better. I'm talking more of the sickle trait rather than sickle disease. So that's how these genes are passed down. Similarly, that there are other sort of hemoglobin variants that also confer the same malaria survival advantage. So those are the hemoglobin C, and there are probably more than 100 of these hemoglobin variants. It's just that the sickle C, the beta thalassemia traits, they're more common, but there are many other ones.
Thank you for that clarification, because I think oftentimes, even as patients within this community, we fully understand how, at least I can speak for myself, I fully understand how SS and how SC manifests, but some of the other phenotypes and genotypes of sickle cell disease are a little nuanced and specific to people from a different ethnic or racial background. We had spoken to Dr. Vence Bonham, and he kind of walked us through the history of sickle cell disease, starting with when it was discovered in 1910 with Walter Clement Noel, all the way to 98 when hydroxyurea was then approved as the standard of care for sickle cell disease. Can you share with us some of the advances that have been made in treating sickle cell disease to present day?
Sure. I think Dr. Bonham did a nice job, in introducing hydroxyurea as the first medicine that's been approved for sickle disease. I would say there have been just a lot of what I call basic, meaning in the laboratory type of research, trying to understand sickle better and really trying to find alternatives and just additional therapies to hydroxyurea. And, I think with, since 1980s, 1990s into the present, a lot of work did go into it, but it's not until the last about 6 or 7 years where there are additional medications. So there are 3 additional medications other than hydroxyurea now have been approved, so that total 4. I'll just use the generic names because I find them easier to pronounce. The first one is L-glutamine, or some people call it Endari. Those are the powder that you have to dissolve, and you take it probably twice a day, and that's mainly used to help to reduce painful crises and also potentially hospitalizations for pain crises. The second one is called Voxelotor or Oxbryta. It works very differently than the L-glutamine. It tries to ask the hemoglobin molecule to hang on to the oxygen just a little longer, so that it doesn't the sickle hemoglobin doesn't stack them up as much when the oxygen is bound to it. And when the hemoglobin molecule doesn't stack up, they don't the red cells don't sickle as much. So that's what the Voxelotor does. And the last one is something called crizanlizumab. It's an actual infusion rather than oral medication. And it's an infusion initially given twice a month, and then subsequently just once a month. That's also used to reduce painful crises, and it works differently than all the other ones in that it makes the red blood cells and the platelets a little less sticky. As we know, part of the pain crises is when the red blood cells, they stick to each other and stick to the blood vessels. And
On the next episode of Through the Genes podcast, we sit down with CRISPR gene editing recipient Jimmy Olahere to learn more about his journey with this curative therapy.
Based on that, would you recommend CRISPR gene therapy to other warriors?
No, not really. And I say that because I think everyone has a different journey in life. So I definitely would say it works, and I would recommend it to someone like me who's.
Through the Genes is funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute, part of the National Institutes of Health, through the Democratizing Education for Sickle Cell Disease Gene Therapy Project. Don't forget to follow Sickle Cell Prodigy and Through the Pain, Inc. for additional resources and initiative updates. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Through the Genes.